Hello students, welcome to Legacy IAS Academy. In today's video, we are going to discuss about a very important question that is being raised to the Western media, especially British Broadcasting Corporation, also referred as BBC from the United Kingdom. Now the question is that why the Western media such as BBC, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they use the word militant as far as the attacks and strikes on India is concerned for the terrorist, but use the word terrorist whenever such attack is carried out in the Western countries. And the best example of this we can see from the two contrasting term that is used by these medias. So for example, when the 9/11 attack happened in US, the term used for those attackers was terrorist by the BBC, but the same BBC has used the term militant for the attackers, the terrorists who killed 26 innocent civilians in the Pahalgam valley of the India recently. So let us try to understand and analyze this in more detail. Now also we have to understand the central government of India has taken into consideration this what you can call as the coverage of the BBC, and it has formally objected by writing a letter to the BBC India chief Jackie Martin. Now obviously the central government in this regard has raised a strong objection that why the media, the BBC, is using the term militant instead of terrorist in their reporting. The concerns has been raised, and also the XP division of the Ministry of External Affairs also they have said that they will keep on looking at such kind of what you can call as the issues, and will try to talk and what you can call as discuss these issues in detail. Now we try to take a look at in what context we are discussing this particular news. So if you look at the headlines that was published after the Pahalgam killings, you can see the BBC has reported at least 5 killed after the gunmen opened fire. So initially they also have shied away from using the term even militant. They have used the term gunmen, obviously referring to that they do not have any kind of recognition as such or identity as such, while it is clearly, or it was clearly established from very beginning that it was a terrorist who were behind such kind of attacks, open fire on tourists in Kashmir. Similarly, if you look at the reporting from the New York Times, a prestigious newspaper from the United States of America, it also has used the term at least 24 tourists gunned down by the militants in the Kashmir region. So this is where the objection is being raised, because even if we talk about the Indian media, from very early they have begun to use the term terrorist here. Apart from this, if you talk about the Washington Post, again you can see similar kind of headlines. Militants kill at least 26 tourists at a resort in Indian controlled Kashmir. And not only these agencies, but Reuters, again a very famous newspaper agency from United Kingdom, and the Associated Press also have chosen similar language to classify the attack in the Pahalgam region. Now, it is not only that the government of India has protested and has raised this issue, even if we talk about the House Foreign Affairs Committee, majority, which we can call as the wing of the United States government, they also have said that the article published by New York Times, or the heading used by New York Times, where the term militants is used, is incorrect. And this you can see from the X post that they have actually put up here. So you can see they have written, "Hey, at New York Times, we have fixed it for you. It was a terrorist attack, plain and simple." So even the US government believes that it was a terrorist attack. So why Western media, including BBC and New York Times, are using different terms and militants and all that? Similar kind of question was raised by the Hindu American Foundation also, where they have claimed that the Western media agencies are basically trying to erase what you can call as, or sanitize, the nature of attack that took place in the Pahalgam. They are trying to hide the victims' religious identities and are calling terrorists militants, and are putting terror attack in smear quotes. This is not just a tragic story, it's deliberate erasure of the nature of threat and the nature of violence that India, and specifically in the Kashmir region, has faced. So let us first try to understand that what is the difference between the term terrorists and militant, or terrorism and militancy in general. Now, many times earlier also you would have seen both terms are used interchangeably. However, it does not mean that both refer to similar kind of attack or similar kind of mentality or ideology. There is a clear difference between them, and this experts have argued on various different fronts as well. So, if we first of all talk about the definition of terrorism in India. So we have an act that is called as Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967. Now under UAPA, terrorist is defined as any such person, organization, or group of person whoever does any act with intent to threaten or likely to threaten the unity, integrity, security, and the sovereignty of India, or also with intent to strike terror or likely to strike terror in the people or any section of people in India or even in any foreign country. Now, if you try to evaluate the recent Pahalgam incident based on the UAP's definition, then obviously we will not have any problem in categorizing this attack as a terrorist attack, because obviously the main motive behind such attack was to obviously create a terror in the people or the section of people. Similarly, if we talk about the Encyclopedia Britannica, there also the terrorism or terrorist has been defined as the calculated use of violence to create a general climate of fear in a population and thereby to bring about a particularly political objective. And on this basis also we can classify the recent incident as a terrorism. Now, on the other hand, when we talk about the term militancy or militant, it basically refers to such kind of armed rebellion. When we talk about armed rebellion, we are talking about when a section of population takes up arm against the established government, largely to achieve certain political or social outcome. So that is when we can call it as a militancy or militants. That means in the context of India, if we try to understand, when the citizens of India, suppose in certain regions, when they take up arm against the state in the form of an armed rebellion, that we see in the case of left-wing extremism in the case of central India or eastern India, so that can be termed as militancy. However, this particular attack was clearly a case of terrorist attack. It was not an armed rebellion by the group of Indian people or Indian citizen, or the attack did not originated within a state. We know that the identity of attackers have been confirmed. They came from outside of India. They were largely trained in Pakistan, and through the infiltration of border, that is how they have entered into the Indian territory. So we should not be shying away from using the term terrorist and terrorism in this particular case. Now, this is not the only case where the Western media has shown what you can call as a double standard in using of such term. Earlier also, if you take a case of Niger, while Niger was killed, he was labeled as terrorist and declared as terrorist in India. But at the same time, if you look at the headings of Washington Post, they have referred him as a simply Canadian citizen. Not only that, BBC even referred him as a Sikh separatist activist rather than calling him terrorist. Also, AP, that is Associated Press, called him as a Sikh independent advocate as such. And same goes on with the Gurupatwant Singh Pannu, who is the current leader of the Sikh for Justice Party. He has been declared and designated as a terrorist in India. But Time magazine, when they took the interview of him, they described him as a New York-based lawyer and general counsel for Sikh for Justice. So all these basically points out the double standard in using of the term, where politically correct terms are something that the Western media generally prefers whenever it comes about the attacks in the Asian countries, African countries. Even if we talk about in case of Hamas, the BBC has not termed Hamas as a terrorist party or terrorist organization. They have shied away from it. So when we talk about terrorists and militants, one thing we have to be very clear, that though the three terms terrorist, militants and radical seems very similar and are also generally interchangeably used, we have to be clear that they are not same and they should not be used in place of one another. We should have a clear cut understanding when to use which of the term. And there may not be many consensus. For example, even to talk about at the global scale, at the United Nations, there has been a long period deliberation that is going on to how to define a terrorist. So we do not have a general consensus, but at least in the UN itself, we have a common definition, and there is a great deal of consensus over the conceptual and essential constituents of the term. So we understand that what basically each of these terms refer to. Now let us try to understand from the UN perspective as well, like what kind of conventional rule or customary rule defines a attack as a terrorist attack or attacker as a terrorist. So the customary rule to define terrorism requires three key elements. Let us try to evaluate the Pahalgam incident on the basis of these three key elements as well. The first element is when the perpetration of a criminal act is being done, such as murder, kidnapping, hostage taking, arson, and so on, or threatening of such act. Now, obviously, if you talk about Pahalgam incident, this angle can be ticked because obviously it was a brutal act of murder, a cowardly, dastardly act of murder that we can say was carried out by the terrorist here. Second is the intent to spread fear among the population. Now, obviously, most of such kind of terrorist attack, one general, what you can say, ideology behind it is by killing of the people, they want to create a mass panic and fear and spread this in the society, or directly or indirectly coerce a national or international authority to take some action or to refrain from taking it. So on this angle also we can justify that yes, this was a terrorist attack. And third, when the act involves a transnational element, now obviously there is no doubt about it that the origin of this threat, origin of this terrorist attack has come from the Pakistan, from the other side of the border. So there is obviously a transnational element involved there. So even if you try to evaluate this term from on the basis of UN rule, we can clearly say that this was a case of terrorism and this was a terrorist attack. So the question is that why newsroom across the world shy away from using such terms? And the answer can be understood by what we can call as the newsroom style sheets. Newsroom style sheets basically refer to news organizations worldwide who do not necessarily follow the definitions by the respective governments. That means what we are trying to say here is that even if UK government uses the term terrorism or terrorist for certain groups or certain incidents, the BBC or any other news agency of UK are not bound to use the same term. Same goes for the US or any other country as such. So what they basically use is their own style sheets that is being prepared by them. In case of BBC, if we talk about, they have their own news style guide that determines which term had to be used for which particular case. So according to this, the term militant has to be used instead of terrorist, and that is why the reporting we see is using of this term. Similarly, if we talk about the Associated Press, it has clearly advised its editor to use against using of any words such as terrorist and terrorism as such. So to some extent we can understand that it was the newsroom style sheets that determines the use of this word. And this is not the only case. Even in the earlier responses of the BBC, they have clearly said that as far as the use of word terrorism is concerned, they believe that it is a loaded word which people use about an outfit they disapprove of morally. And how BBC is trying to defend its decision to not use the word terrorism is saying that it's simply not the job of BBC to tell people who to support and who to condemn. It is not the job of BBC to determine who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. Now this makes clearly makes sense, because obviously it is not the job of this news agencies to tell people that these are the good people and these are the bad people. But the current case that we're talking about is what we can say is there is a clear difference about being impartial and being blind. So not using the word terrorism in this case of the attack that has taken place in Pahalgam, we can associate it with being blind, and that is what clearly we can see here. And not in this is that we can see that is happening in the recent times. Even during the World War II, if we talk about the BBC broadcasters, they were expressly told not to call the Nazis evil or wicked, even though they have used the term enemy to represent them. So this entire issue that we talk about, or the use or non-uses of such terms by the international media such as BBC, is something that is largely defined by what we have discussed before, newsroom style seats as such. Now, what about India? So if you talk about the time period before the 9/11, most of the English publications in India also have used the word militancy for terror attacks in Kashmir. However, after the 9/11, the style has changed, and especially after that, now we very commonly see the use of word terrorist. And it's not in my basically we talk about that what extent the journalists who are reporting from the ground do have control over the using the term. So we have to understand that it is not the journalist who finally decide what actually will be published in the what you can call as the media, print media or the electronic media. Rather they say that it is the job of the editors who might be sitting in the office, and even if journalists write the term terrorist, the editor can change it to militant and anything else as they want as such. Now this is how we can understand the practice has changed in India. However, in BBC and other Western media, we still see use of the same term as such. Also, one thing we have to understand here that in India, till in the early 1980s, early 1990s, the use of word militancy for Kashmir was very common, because that time the government believed that local people are supporting to a large extent this kind of incident and local peoples have taken arm. But after that, since 2000, what we are seeing is that most of the cases of the attack that is taking place on the Indian soil seems to be originating from across the border, and more specifically from the Pakistan. And that is why the use of term terrorist is much more accurate, and this is why the use of term terrorist incident and the terrorist attack in case of Pahalgam also makes sense, because the threat has originated from outside of India, from across the border. That is all about this particular video. If you like the video, please hit the like button, share it with fellow aspirants, as well as subscribe to our channel for more such content. Thank you very much.